The road to Moss Creek was a single thread of cracked asphalt, winding like a serpent through the suffocating embrace of the Kentucky woods. For the last 10 miles, the trees had pressed in, their branches weaving a canopy that turned the afternoon light a murky, underwater green. Alara's car, a city-slick sedan out of place on the pitted road, seemed to sink into the silence. The only sound was the crunch of gravel under her tires and the low hum of an engine that had carried her from a world of noise and anonymity back to the one she had fought so hard to escape. She had not come back willingly. The formal, typewritten letter informing her of her grandmother's passing had been a stone dropped into the placid pond of her life, sending out ripples of a grief she had thought neatly packed away. Now the grief was a physical weight in her chest, a cold stone of loss. But beneath it, coiling like a second, colder serpent, was a deep and familiar unease. The town announced itself not with a sign, but with a subtle shift in the air. The scent of damp earth and decaying leaves gave way to wood smoke and the faint, sweet rot smell of a nearby creek. The first houses appeared, weathered clapboard structures with sagging porches, their paint bleached to muted shades of gray and forgotten blue. They were spaced far apart, yet each one felt like it was watching her pass. She pulled up to her grandmother's house, her house now, the lawyer had said. The 2-story frame building seemed to hunch into itself, its porch boards groaning a protest under her weight as she climbed the steps. The key turned with a heavy, metallic clunk that echoed in the profound stillness. Inside, the air was still and cool, smelling of old wood, dried herbs and absinthe. Through the dusty window pane, she watched the town. A man emerged from the general store, his movements slow and deliberate. A woman hanging laundry on a line paused, her hand frozen on a clothespin as she looked toward the unfamiliar car. Their faces, even from a distance, held a vague, unsettling sameness. A particular set to the eyes, a shared slope of the shoulder. It was more than just familial resemblance. It was a uniformity of posture, a collective weary gait that made them seem less like individuals and more like parts of a single, tired organism. They didn't stare openly. Their glances were fleeting, sidelong, before they turned quickly back to their tasks, enveloping her return in a heavy, watchful silence. Alara wrapped her arms around herself, the stone of grief in her chest now ice-cold, her homecoming feeling less like a return and more like an intrusion. The silence inside the house was a presence, thick and watchful. Alara moved through the dim parlor, her footsteps muffled by the worn wool rug her grandmother had hooked decades before. Grief was a dull, constant ache, but it was now edged with a sharper, more probing disquiet. The faces outside the window, the heavy silence of the town. It all clung to her, a chill she couldn't shake. The task was a somber one, sorting through a life reduced to objects. Each item was a fossil, a piece of a history she only half knew. A china teacup with a hairline crack. A stack of quilts, their patterns faded by years of sun and wash. A faint scent of lavender and camphorewood clung to everything, the ghost of her grandmother's meticulous care. In the bottom drawer of an ancient oak dresser, beneath a stack of neatly folded linens that smelled of cedar, she found it. A journal, bound and worn, cracked leather the color of dried blood. It was heavier than it looked, its pages thick and warped with age. A small, rusted lock held it shut, the metal flaking orange onto her fingertips. She ran a thumb over the embossed cover, feeling the ghost of a pattern long since smoothed away. Felt secret, final. A thing meant to stay closed. Beside it lay a faded candy tin. Inside, nestled in yellowed tissue paper, were photographs. Dozens of them curling at the edges. Formal portraits in stiff collars and serious faces. Snapshots of picnics by the creek. Group photos outside the white clapboard church. Alara's breath caught. She spread them on the floorboards, the faces looking up at her through a sepia haze. The initial pang of nostalgia quickly curdled into something else. A cold knot tightened in her stomach. It was in the eyes. In photograph after photograph, across generations marked by changing fashions and fading ink, the same pale, wide-set eyes looked back at her. They were her grandmother's eyes. They were her own. In one portrait from what looked like the turn of the century, A severe-looking woman had the same distinct, slightly asymmetrical mole just above her lip that Alara had always been self-conscious about. Another showed a young man with her exact jawline, the same stubborn set to his mouth. This was more than just family resemblance. This was repetition, a recurring blueprint of features, stamped again and again across the decades. The eerie uniformity she'd sensed in the town was here, documented in this tin box. Her gaze fell back to the locked journal. The rusted lock seemed to glare at her, a silent sentinel guarding the reasons why. A deep, superstitious reluctance held her back. A feeling that prying would be a violation of a privacy her grandmother had fiercely maintained. This was her grief warring with a new, sickening suspicion. She held the journal, its weight a promise of truth and a threat of despair, and hesitated, caught between the woman she had loved and the terrifying reality she might have hidden. The journal's lock gave way with a brittle snap, the sound unnaturally loud in the hushed room. Alara's heart hammered against her ribs. She had used a hairpin, her hands trembling, the act feeling like a desecration. The leather cover fell open, releasing a scent of old paper and dust. But tucked inside the back cover, hidden beneath a loose piece of end paper, was something else. A single sheet of parchment, carefully folded, its edges soft with age. She unfolded it with reverent care, spreading it on the floor beside the scattered photographs. It was a family tree, but unlike any she had ever seen. The script was elegant, meticulous. The ink faded to a sepia brown. Names branched downward from a single couple at the top, Elias and Mary Moss, 1822. But it was the lines connecting them that made the air leave her lungs. They did not simply branch out. They curved back in on themselves, weaving a dense, tangled web. Some marriages were marked not with a single line, but with a double one, two dark strokes that seemed to emphasize a union. Besides several of these, small, cryptic symbols were inked. Interlocked rings, a tiny closed eye, a knot that had no beginning and no end. Her eyes, trained by years of architectural drafting, began to trace the patterns, the dreadful geometry of it. A branch from the 1890s showed a double-line marriage between a Samuel Moss and an Eleanor Moss. Their father's name was the same. Siblings. Her throat went dry. Further down, in the 1930s, two cousins. Their connection, marked with that same knotted symbol, produced a line that led, inexorably, to her grandmother's name, Lillian. She followed Lillian's line. It connected with a double stroke to a Thomas Brewer. A Brewer, not a Moss. A flicker of relief was instantly extinguished as her finger traced Thomas's line back up the page. His grandmother was a Moss. The lines crossed again, the blood circling back on itself in a tight, inescapable loop. The dates ground the horror in history, made it real and relentless. This wasn't a recent hardship. This was a 200-year project, a deliberate, documented narrowing. The symbols were a code she could not fully decipher, but their meaning was chillingly clear. They were markers for purity, for keeping the land and the name and the blood contained within these wooded hollows. The photographs around her seemed to shift. The repeated eyes, the familiar jawlines, the recurring mole, they were no longer curious family traits. They were evidence. The faces stared up, a silent, generations-deep chorus confirming what the parchment revealed. A deep, cold dread settled in her bones. A dread that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with the terrifying, interwoven truth of her own blood. The need for supplies was a flimsy excuse, but it was the only one Alara had to venture back into the heart of the town. The general store was the only commercial establishment in Moss Creek. A long, low building of weathered clapboard with a faded sign that simply read goods. A bell above the door chimed her entrance, the sound seeming to suck the quiet conversation from the room. Three locals stood near a barrel of pickles, their talk dying mid-sentence. Their movements stilled in unison, a subtle, shared freeze that was more unnerving than if they had openly stared. Alara recognized the postures, the same slight stoop to the shoulders, the same way of holding the hands slightly curled. It was like watching variations of the same person. Behind the counter, an older man with the now familiar wide-set eyes looked up from a ledger. His name, J. Moss, was stitched in red thread on his shirt pocket. Alara's own grandmother's maiden name. "Help you?" he asked, his voice neutral, his eyes not quite meeting hers. "Just a few things," she said, her voice sounding too loud in the hushed space. She gathered a loaf of bread, some coffee, a can of beans, placing them on the counter. She could feel the weight of the other customers' gazes on her back. "You're Lillian's girl," the man, J. Moss, said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, Alara." He nodded slowly, bagging her items with deliberate, economical movements. "Heard you was back. Sorry for your loss. Your grandmother was a private woman. Kept to herself, the words were a practiced deflection, a wall built of polite evasion. "Thank you," Alara said, seizing the opening. "I'm trying to learn more about her, about the family. I found some old photographs." She let the sentence hang. The man's hands stilled on the bag. One of the women by the pickle barrel shifted her weight, the floorboard creaking under her foot. "Old families got old pictures," J. Moss said, his tone final. He turned to his ledger, making a notation. Alara's eyes flicked down. The page was a list of names, accounts owed. Moss, Brewer, Moss, Sawyer, Moss. The same surnames over and over, a closed circuit of commerce and credit. "I suppose they do," Alara said, her politeness a thin veneer over mounting frustration. "It's just, I noticed so many similarities. In the faces." He looked up then, and his gaze was no longer neutral. It was flat, warning. "Blood tells. Ain't much new blood comes to the creek. Things stay familiar." He pushed the bag toward her. "That'll be $6.40. The transaction was over. The message was clear. As she took the bag, the other customers began to talk again. Their voices a low murmur about the weather, a deliberate and collective dismissal. Alara stepped back out into the pale daylight, the bell chiming behind her. The whispers seemed to follow her out the door, clinging to her like cobwebs. They hadn't been silent. They had been expertly, infuriatingly evasive, and their shared name on that ledger felt less like a fact and more like a brand. The bell above the door of the general store chimed, a thin, tinny sound that seemed to startle the thick, dusty air. Inside, the light was dim, filtering through windows clouded with age. The scent of cured ham, coffee beans, and old wood filled Alara's nostrils. 3 figures, 2 men and a woman, clustered near a barrel of flour, fell silent as one, their conversation evaporating. Their faces, etched with the same weary patience, turned toward her not with hostility, but with a unified, watchful stillness that was far more disconcerting. Behind the counter, an older man with the now hauntingly familiar wide-set eyes looked up from a thick, leather-bound ledger. His hands, speckled with age, paused over the page. The name J. Moss was neatly stitched on his worn shirt pocket. Moss, her grandmother's name, her own blood. "Help you?" he asked, his voice a low, gravelly murmur. His gaze didn't quite meet hers, settling somewhere on the counter between them. "Just a few things," Alara said, her own voice feeling fragile in the heavy silence. She collected a loaf of bread, a can of coffee, some tinned milk, placing them on the scarred wooden counter. The eyes of the other patrons were physical weights on her back. "You're Lillian's girl," the shopkeeper stated. It was not a question. "Alara." "Yes." He nodded slowly, his movements economical as he began to bag her items. "Heard you was back. Sorry for your loss. Your grandmother was a private woman. Didn't much care for talk about the past." The words were a well-practiced shield, offered with a tone of finality that brooked no argument. "Thank you," she said, clinging to her courtesy. "I'm trying to understand her better. I found some of her old things. Photographs, mostly. The family resemblance is remarkable." The man's hands stilled. A floorboard creaked as one of the men by the flour barrel shifted his weight. "Old families have old faces," J. Moss said, his tone flattening. He turned back to his ledger, dipping his pen in an inkwell. Alara's eyes dropped to the page. It was a list of accounts, names written in a tight, cursive hand. Moss, Brewer, Moss, Sawyer, Moss. The same few surnames repeated down the page in a closed loop of debt and dependency. I suppose they do, Elara replied, her frustration a hot coil in her chest, carefully banked. She needed them to talk to her, not shut her out. It's so consistent, across so many years. He looked up then, and his gaze was no longer neutral. It was a quiet, firm warning. Blood tells. Ain't much new comes to the creek. Things stay as they are. He closed the ledger with a soft thud. That'll be $570. The transaction was over. The message received. As she took the paper bag, the low murmur of conversation resumed behind her. A deliberate and collective turning away. Stepping back outside, the bell's chime felt like a dismissal. They hadn't been silent. They had been expertly, maddeningly evasive, and the evidence of their shared names in that ledger felt less like a record and more like a confession. The encounter at the store left Elara feeling exposed, her questions hanging in the air like dust motes. She took the long way back to the house, her footsteps slow on the packed earth path that wound behind the white-clapboard church. The air was still, heavy with the scent of damp soil and honeysuckle. A movement in the shadows of the church's rear vestibule made her start. An elderly woman emerged, frail as a dried leaf, leaning heavily on a knotted cane. It was Martha, whom she'd seen occasionally at the edges of gatherings. Her eyes, pale and clouded with cataracts, were nonetheless sharp, pinning Elara in place. "Child," Martha whispered, her voice a dry rustle. She gestured with a trembling hand for Elara to come closer, into the concealing shade of the building. Her gaze darted toward the empty path before returning to Elara's face. "You're asking questions. Stirring the pot." Elara's heart thudded. "My grandmother. I knew Lillian. Knew her all her life." Martha interrupted, her voice low and urgent. "We all did what we had to. The world out there." She gestured vaguely toward the woods, the single road out. "It wanted to take everything. Our land. Our ways. Marrying close. It kept things pure. Kept what was ours ours." She said it not with pride, but with a bone-deep weariness, as stating a simple, brutal fact of life. Elara felt a coldness seep into her. "Close." Martha's eyes held hers, and in their milky depths, Elara saw a lifetime of resigned acceptance. "Cousins. Sometimes closer. The land don't split well. The blood stays strong. But it comes with a cost, child. A heavy cost. Always does." She looked over Elara's shoulder, her body tensing. "You didn't hear it from me, but you have a right to know what you've come back to." Before Elara could form another question, Martha turned, her cane tapping softly on the stone step as she retreated into the deeper shadows of the church, leaving Elara alone with the echo of her warning. A confession offered not in sin, but in survival, and a dread that now had a name. The key, cold and heavy in her palm, felt less like a tool and more like a verdict. Elara sat at her grandmother's small writing desk, the locked journal before her. The encounter with Martha had stripped away the last veil of ambiguity. The words "marrying close" and "a heavy cost" echoed in the silent room, giving shape to the dread that had been coiling inside her since she'd first seen the family tree. Her thumb traced the journal's worn leather cover, the surface smooth in some places, cracked and rough in others. The small, rusted lock seemed to glare in the low light of the oil lamp. This was the final barrier between her and the truth her grandmother had carried. With a breath that shuddered in her chest, she inserted the key. It turned with a gritty, reluctant scrape, the sound final and profound in the hushed house. The lock sprang open. Elara hesitated, a last moment of respect for the woman she had loved warring with the need to understand the world that had made her. Slowly, she lifted the cover. The pages were thick, yellowed at the edges, filled with her grandmother's precise, looping script in faded blue ink. The first entry was dated spring, 1948. April 12th. The agreement is made. I am to marry Thomas Brewer come autumn. Mother says it is a good match, that our lines are strong and the land will be joined. He is a kind man, quiet. I have known him all my life, of course. We played together as children by the creek. It is a duty, not a desire. This is how it is done. We do what is necessary to keep the blood strong, to hold what is ours against the world. It is the way of the creek star. Alara's breath caught. The words were not written in anger or passion, but with a simple, chilling resignation. Her grandmother's voice, remembered as warm and firm, was here on the page as pragmatic and unflinching. A duty, not a desire. She turned the page, the paper whispering secrets. Asterisk May 3rd. Saw Thomas in town. He tipped his hat. We did not speak. There is no courtship as they have in books. It is a settled matter. His people and mine have been joined before. His grandmother was a moss. Mama says this is good, that it strengthens the line, keeps the traits pure. I look at my brothers and sisters, at my cousins, and I see the same eyes looking back. It is a comfort, she says, to know your own. Sometimes I wonder, star. The entries continued, a chronicle of practical preparations. A dress was sewn. Parcel of land was deeded. There was no mention of love, of yearning. Only the quiet, inexorable movement toward a union that was presented not as a choice, but as a fact of life, as natural and unchangeable as the seasons that turned the hills around Moss Creek. Alara read. Her horror a cold, internal scream contrasted sharply with her grandmother's calm, accepting script. The voice of a woman who had never known another path was possible. The pages turned, each one a deeper descent into the quiet, normalized horror of Moss Creek. Alara's grandmother's script remained steady, her tone matter-of-fact, as if documenting the weather or a successful harvest rather than the tightly woven fate of a bloodline. Asterisk October 22, 1949. Our son, Elias, was born this morning. He is small, but has the moss eyes, clear as creek water. Thomas is proud. Mother says he is the image of her own father at birth. The blood tells star. Alara's fingers trembled as she traced the words. The blood tells the same phrase the shopkeeper had used. It was a mantra here, a justification. Asterisk March 3, 1952. A daughter, Eleanor. She is beautiful but fretful. The doctor from Millerton said she has a fragile constitution, that we must be watchful. Thomas says it is just the way of some babies. God's will. We will pray for her strength, star. The entry was stark in its dismissal. A child's poor health was not a cause for medical concern but an act of fate to be endured. Alara thought of the family tree, of the symbols beside certain names. The closed eye. Was that the symbol for a fragile constitution? For a life that flickered too briefly? Asterisk July 15, 1955. Little James, our second boy, was taken by a fever last night. Dr. Evans said there was nothing to be done, that some children are just not meant for this world. The soil here is thin, he says, the air bad for the lungs. We buried him beside his grandfather. The Lord gives and the Lord takes away, star. Alara felt a wave of nausea. The soil here is thin, not a genetic predisposition weakened by generations of repetition, but bad dirt. A collective, convenient lie agreed upon by an entire community to explain away the devastating toll of their choices. She could see their faces now, the men at the store, the woman hanging laundry, and wondered how many of them bore the hidden cost. How many had lost siblings or children to this whispered folklore of bad soil and God's will. Asterisk September 10th, 1958. My sister and has married her cousin, Robert Moss. It is a good match. The land adjoins. Mama is pleased. The family remains strong. We are all together here, safe in our valley. It is the only way, star. The finality in that sentence. Asterisk it is the only way asterisk was a stone in Alara's gut. This was the quiet acceptance Martha had spoken of. It was not celebration. It was resignation woven into the very fabric of survival. The journal didn't scream its secrets. It murmured them in the weary, pragmatic voice of a woman who saw no alternative, who loved her children and her family even as the same practices that bound them together also made them vulnerable. Alara closed the book, the weight of it unbearable. The faces from the photographs now had stories, and the stories were all the same. A legacy of love, loss, and a terrifying necessary denial. The oil lamp guttered on the dresser, casting a low, wavering light that did little to push back the deep shadows crowding the bedroom. Alara stood before the heavy, tarnished mirror that had hung in this same spot for generations. Her own face looked back at her, pale and drawn in the dimness, but it was no longer just her face. It was a living page from the journal, a breathing entry in the family tree. Her eyes, wide and unsettled, were the same pale, wide-set moss eyes that stared from every photograph, from every generation. But it was her jawline that held her gaze now, that made a cold sweat break out on the back of her neck. It was strong, with a slight, stubborn squareness to it, the Moss Creek jaw. She had seen it in the severe portrait of the woman from the turn of the century, in the young man from the 1930s snapshot, in the faded image of her own great-grandfather. It was a feature noted with pride in her grandmother's journal. Asterisk, he has the jaw, the strong line star. She had always thought it was just her face, a quirk of genetics. Now she saw it for what it was, a brand, a hereditary stamp passed down through a closed loop of blood, unchanged and unchanging. She leaned closer, her breath fogging the cold glass. The lamplight caught the slight asymmetry of her features, the particular arch of her brow. All of it echoed in the faces she had spread across the floor downstairs. A wave of visceral dread, cold and nauseating, washed over her. This was not intellectual curiosity anymore. This was a physical truth staring her in the face. Her own body was a map of Moss Creek, a living testament to its 2 centuries of isolation. The blood in her veins was not just her own. It was theirs. It was the product of duty, not desire, of survival forged in a crucible of necessity that had calcified into tradition. She stumbled back from the mirror, her hand flying to her mouth. The room tilted. She was not just an observer of this history. She was its product. Every feature she had ever considered uniquely hers was a shared heirloom, a relic of the very practices that filled her with horror. The reflection in the glass was no longer just Alara. It was the ghost of every Moss who had ever looked into the same mirror, and the dread of what that meant settled into her bones, cold and absolute. The path to the creek was little more than a deer trail, worn smooth by generations of feet. Alara walked it with her grandmother's journal tucked under her arm, its weight a constant, grim reminder. She needed air, space, anything to escape the claustrophobic truth of the house and its secrets. The woods were dense, the afternoon sun filtering through the canopy in broken, dusty shafts. She heard him before she saw him, the soft crunch of boots on dry leaves. Rounding a bend in the trail, she stopped short. A man was kneeling by the water's edge, his back to her, filling a canteen. He stood slowly, turning at the sound of her halted footsteps. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The air grew still, heavy with the hum of insects and something else, something charged and deeply unnerving. He was tall, with broad shoulders that spoke of farm work. But it was his face that made her breath catch in her throat. He had the Moss Creek jaw, strong and unmistakable. And his eyes, they were the same pale, wide-set hazel as her own, as her grandmother's, as the dozens of faces in the photographs. When he offered a hesitant, closed-lipped smile, a dimple appeared in his left cheek, a perfect mirror of her own. "You must be Alara," he said finally, his voice low and quiet, like the creek itself. He didn't approach, just stood his ground, his gaze holding hers with an intensity that felt less like welcome and more like recognition. "I am," she managed, her own voice faint. "Caleb Moss," he gestured vaguely up the hill. "I live just yonder. I was sorry to hear about your grandmother," he paused, and the silence stretched, thick with unspoken things. His eyes traveled over her face, and she saw the same dawning, uncomfortable awareness in his expression that was chilling her from within. "You have her eyes," he said, the words simple, but laden with a meaning that went far deeper than observation. "So do you," she heard herself reply, the words escaping before she could stop them. Another awkward pause hung between them. The attraction was there, a low, instinctual pull, but it was immediately twisted and soured by the terrifying context. It wasn't chemistry. It was genetics, asserting itself with a ruthless, biological inevitability. The familiarity was the problem. The dimples, the jaw, the eyes. It was like looking into a slightly distorted mirror of herself, and the feeling it provoked was a deep primal discomfort. "Well?" he said, breaking the tense silence. He shifted his weight, looking down at the canteen in his hand as if he'd forgotten it was there. "I should let you be. It's quiet out here. Good for thinking." He gave her one last, lingering look, his hazel eyes filled with a conflict she recognized all too well. A mix of curiosity, caution, and something like shame. Then he turned and moved back up the path, his form soon swallowed by the shadows of the trees. Alara remained by the creek, her heart hammering, the journal feeling like a lead weight. The encounter hadn't been romantic. It had been a confrontation with her own blood, and the immediate, unnerving pull she'd felt toward Caleb Moss was the most terrifying secret the creek had revealed yet. The invitation, if it could be called that, was a folded note left on her porch step, the paper crisp and unfamiliar. * community supper. Town hall. 6 p.m. * no signature, just the implication of an obligation. Alara held it, the paper feeling like a warrant. She had not been invited. She had been summoned to observe, to be assessed. The town hall was a long, low building, its windows glowing with the warm, smoky light of oil lamps. The hum of conversation and the clatter of dishes spilled out into the cooling evening air as she approached. Inside, the heat was a physical wall, thick with the smell of roasted meat, baked beans, and the close press of bodies. She paused just inside the doorway, an outsider on the threshold. The room was a sea of familiar features, a living extension of the photographs and the journal entries. Families clustered around tables, not as separate units, but as a single, interconnected organism. A mother's hand rested possessively on her teenage son's shoulder, her fingers brushing the same distinctive jawline he possessed. Two sisters, their matching wide-set eyes crinkling with the same laugh, sat with their heads bent close together, their postures mirror images. An older man with a tremor in his right hand was carefully fed a piece of pie by a younger man who shared his nose and the sad slope of his eyes. Their physical proximity was striking, a constant, casual touching. A hand on an arm, a shoulder leaned against another. A child passed from one set of identical arms to another. It wasn't affection. It was ownership, a silent declaration of belonging. And it excluded her completely. She found an empty space at the end of a long bench, the wood groaning under her weight. The conversations around her dipped for a moment, then resumed, a low, buzzing murmur that seemed to consciously flow around her like water around a stone. She was the anomaly, the foreign element in their closed system. She picked at the food on her plate, her appetite gone. She was a spectator at a play where everyone knew their lines but her. Blood tells always has. A woman's voice carried from the next table, followed by a soft, knowing murmur of agreement. "Keep to our own, that's how we survive out here," a man said, his tone final. The phrases, snippets of the town's doctrine, floated to her, reinforcing the themes of her grandmother's journal, of Martha's warning. They were not secrets here. They were truisms, the foundational beliefs of a world that had turned inward for preservation. She watched Caleb across the room, serving himself from a large pot of stew. He glanced up, his hazel eyes meeting hers for a fleeting second. There was no smile, no acknowledgement, just a quick, almost guilty flicker before he looked away, turning back to his family. Aunts, uncles, cousins, all sharing the same telltale features. He was part of this. He belonged. Alara sat perfectly still on the hard bench, the noise and the warmth of the room failing to touch the cold isolation that settled over her. She was not a participant in this gathering. She was a researcher, an anthropologist documenting a strange and insular tribe, and the most chilling part of her study was the dawning realization that her own reflection would fit perfectly into the family portrait she was observing. The journal entry was brief, a single line buried between notes on a harsh winter and a lost calf. * went to the place of the old carvings today. The entrance is more hidden each year. Some truths are best left to the stone *. It was the only mention, a ghost of a clue, but it was enough. The place of the carvings was local folklore, a cave rumored to be a repository for the town's unspoken history. Her grandmother had known of it, had visited it. Alara waited until the afternoon sun was high, its light weak and filtered through the dense canopy. The directions, gleaned from cross-referencing the journal's vague hint with an old survey map she'd found in the attic, led her up a steep, neglected game trail behind the Moss family cemetery. The air grew cooler, damper, carrying the scent of wet rock and decaying leaves. The entrance was exactly as described. Not a grand opening, but a fissure in a moss-covered limestone outcrop, half concealed by a thicket of thorny blackberry vines. It looked less like a landmark and more like a wound in the earth, something the woods were trying to heal over. It felt intentionally obscured, a secret not meant to be found. Pushing the vines aside, their thorns catching on her jacket, she was met with a breath of cold, stagnant air that smelled of ancient damp and something else, a faint metallic tang. The opening was narrow, forcing her to turn sideways to slip through. Inside, the world fell away into a profound, echoing darkness. The only light was the faint gray glow from the entrance, illuminating the first few feet of smooth, water-worn stone. Her flashlight beam cut a shaky path through the blackness, revealing a tunnel that sloped gently downward. The walls were close, the ceiling low enough that she had to duck her head. Every sound was magnified, the scuff of her boots on the gritty floor, the rapid rhythm of her own breathing, the steady drip-drip of water from some unseen source deeper in the mountain. The air was heavy and cold, raising goosebumps on her arms. 20 paces in, the tunnel opened into a slightly larger chamber. And there, illuminated in the circle of her light, were the carvings. They covered a large, flat section of the wall, etched into the rock with painstaking, if crude, precision. They were not mere graffiti, but a deliberate record. Names, dozens of them, worn smooth in places but still legible. Moss, Brewer, Sawyer. Dates accompanied them, stretching back to the mid-1800s. But it was the symbols that made her blood run cold. The names were not listed separately. They were connected by deeply gouged lines, and where those lines met, they were often bound by carved symbols. Interlocked rings, knotted ropes, twin saplings growing from a single root. Her light trembled as she traced the grooves with a tentative finger. The stone was ice-cold. This was no casual hideaway. It was an archive, a cold, hard testament carved in stone, confirming every sickening suspicion the journal and the family tree had only hinted at. The cave wasn't just holding town secrets, it was built of them, and she had just stepped inside. The beam of her flashlight wavered over the cold stone, illuminating the meticulously carved records. The air in the cave was thick and still, heavy with the weight of centuries, each breath tasting of damp mineral and secrets long buried. Alara's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic counter-rhythm to the steady, echoing drip of water from the cavern's ceiling. She moved closer, her boots scuffing softly on the gritty floor. The wall was not just a random collection of names and dates. It was a structured, horrifying ledger. Columns were faintly visible, carved with headings worn smooth by time but still decipherable. Union, issue, survived. Her architectural eye immediately began to trace the patterns, the dreadful, inescapable math of it. Her light settled on one entry from 1872. Elias Moss to Eleanor Moss. The same surname. The line connecting them was not a simple mark but a deep, deliberate double groove. In the issue column, for small hash marks were carved. Beside them, in the survived column, only one. A single name, Thomas. The coefficient of relationship, the genetic overlap, concepts she'd only vaguely understood, were laid bare here in the most brutal, undeniable arithmetic. A brother and a sister. One surviving child from 4. A wave of nausea washed over her, so potent she had to press a hand against the cold, unforgiving stone to steady herself. Her breath came in short, sharp gasps that fogged in the chill air. She stumbled back, the beam of her light jerking wildly across the wall, revealing more of the same. Asterisk 1901. Samuel Brewer to Martha Moss, his first cousin. Issue 3. Survived, 2-star. Asterisk 1935. Thomas Moss to Lillian Brewer, second cousins, shared great-grandparents. Issue 4. Survived 3-star. Her grandmother's marriage. Documented here in stone, a transaction of blood and survival. The journal's resigned acceptance, Martha's weary confession. They were all just echoes of this cold, hard truth chiseled into the mountain's heart. Her light continued to dance, and she saw other, smaller symbols scratched beside some of the names in the survived column. A wavy line, perhaps for the tremors she'd seen in the old man at the supper. A small, closed eye like the one on the family tree, next to a name from 1910. Infirm, the carving seemed to whisper. Fragile constitution. This was the cost Martha had spoken of. Not hidden away in private journals or whispered in church vestibules, but recorded publicly, communally, on the walls of their sacred, hidden archive. They knew. They had always known. The high infant mortality, the recurring ailments, they were documented here not as tragedies to be prevented, but as the inevitable balance sheet of their choice to remain pure, isolated, and theirs. Alara's legs gave way. She didn't sit so much as collapse onto the cold, damp floor of the cave, the flashlight clattering from her numb fingers. It rolled, casting crazy, leaping shadows that made the carved names seem to writhe on the walls. She wrapped her arms around herself, but no amount of pressure could stop the violent trembling that had taken hold of her. The truth was no longer a suspicion or a whispered story. It was here, in the immutable stone around her, and it was more monstrous than she had ever allowed herself to imagine. He found her by the creek 3 days after the gathering, as if he'd been waiting for the right moment, or perhaps for his own courage to solidify. Alara was sitting on a sun-warmed rock, staring at the water but seeing only the carved names on the cave wall. She didn't hear him approach until his shadow fell across her. Alara! She looked up. Caleb stood a few feet away, his hands shoved deep in his pockets, his shoulders hunched. The Moss Creek jaw was tight with tension, and his hazel eyes, so like her own, were shadowed with a conflict that mirrored the turmoil in her own chest. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice low. It wasn't really a question. They both knew they had to. She nodded, shifting on the rock to make space. He didn't sit, instead choosing to lean against a nearby sycamore, putting a careful, deliberate distance between them. "I know you've been looking into things," he began, his gaze fixed on the flowing water. "The journal. The cave," he said the last word quietly, as if it were a profanity. A long pause stretched between them, filled by the babble of the creek. "I always suspected. The way people look. The way they don't talk about things. You're taught it's loyalty. Keeping the family strong. Keeping what's ours." He finally looked at her, and his expression was raw, stripped of the town's careful neutrality. "You're taught it's not something to be ashamed of. It's just the way it is." Another silence. He swallowed hard, the muscle in his jaw working. "My parents. They're first cousins. Their mothers were sisters." The confession came out in a rush, followed by a heavier, more ashamed pause. "They're good people. They love each other. I believe that. But—" He trailed off, and the unsaid words hung in the air, more powerful for their absence. "But at what cost? I look at my little niece," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "She's got a heart murmur. The doctor in Millerton said it's probably nothing, but—" He shook his head, a quick, frustrated gesture. "I look at her, and I look at the old ledgers in the cave, and I worry. I worry about what it means. For her. For any children I might have." He finally said it, the deepest fear, the one that humanized the abstract horror, giving it a face and a future. His dialogue was halting, filled with pauses that spoke volumes more than the words themselves. They were pauses of shame, of a loyalty that was starting to feel like a chain, of a dawning realization that the survival he'd been taught to cherish might be a slowly unfolding tragedy. He wasn't a monster. He was a product, just like her, caught between the only world he'd ever known and the terrifying truth of its foundations. "They'll tell you it's the only way," he said, his voice weary. And for a long time I believed them. Part of me still wants to. It's easier. He pushed away from the tree, finally meeting her eyes directly. His were filled with a painful honesty. But seeing you, asking questions, it makes it harder to look away. He didn't wait for a response. He just turned and walked back up the path, leaving her alone with the water and the weight of his conflicted loyalty. A confession that had offered no answers, only a deeper, more complicated dread. Martha was waiting for her on the back steps of the clapboard church, a shrunken figure wrapped in a faded shawl despite the warmth of the day. Her milky eyes tracked Ilara's approach, and she gestured with a trembling, bird-like hand for her to sit. The air between them was thick with unspoken words, the aftermath of the cave's revelations a cold stone in Ilara's gut. "You went to the stone place," Martha stated, her voice a dry rustle of leaves. It wasn't an accusation, merely a weary acknowledgement. "Saw the marks. Now you know the how. Maybe you need to know the why." She looked out across the overgrown cemetery, where moss and brewer headstones stood in tight, familiar clusters. "It started with the first ones," she began, her tone low and measured, as if reciting a well-worn cautionary tale. "Elias and Mary Moss. They came into this valley in 1822, fleeing hardship back east. They carved a life out of the wilderness, thought they'd found their own promised land. But the world outside, it was greedy, wanted their timber, their land, wanted to change their ways." Martha's gaze grew distant, fixed on a past only the town's stories remembered. "They made a covenant, a purity covenant they called it, swore to each other, and to God, that their blood would stay pure, untainted by outsiders, that this land would be for Moss blood, forever. The first sons married the first daughters. It was duty. It was survival," she said the archaic terms without pride, her voice flat. "They thought they were building a fortress, a wall of their own flesh and blood to keep the world out." She fell silent for a long moment, the only sound the whisper of wind through the tall grass. For a time it worked. The land stayed in the family. The name stayed strong. But walls work both ways. Child Martha turned her clouded eyes back to Ilara, and in their depths was a profound, generations-deep regret. They kept the world out, but they also locked themselves in. The covenant became a chain, the pride of the founders. She shook her head slowly, a gesture of infinite sadness. "That pride became our prison, and we've been living in it ever since." She didn't elaborate. She didn't need to. The carved names in the cave, the journal entries, the faces in town, they were all the evidence required. Martha's story wasn't a boast of origin. It was a grim epitaph for a choice made 2 centuries ago, a warning about the terrible, enduring cost of a promise meant to ensure survival, but which had ultimately ensured only isolation. The cold, damp truth of the cave clung to Ilara like a second skin as she walked into the Moss Creek Town Hall. The building, usually a place of hushed community suppers and shared, wary glances, now felt like a tribunal. She had asked for this meeting, a formal request delivered to Jeremiah Moss, the eldest of the town's informal council of elders and the keeper of the general store. He had agreed with a grim, silent nod. They were waiting for her inside, 3 of them, seated behind a long oak table that looked as old as the town itself. Jeremiah Moss, his hands, the ones that had bagged her groceries with such economical finality, rested flat on the wood. To his right sat Eleanor Brewer, a woman whose sharp eyes missed nothing, and to his left Samuel Sawyer, his right hand resting on his knee, the faint, constant tremor she'd noticed at the gathering now unmistakable in the still room. The air was thick with the smell of old wood and lemon polish. An oil lamp on the table cast their faces in sharp relief, deepening the lines of age and the familiar, dreaded features they all shared. "Ilara," Jeremiah began, his voice the same low gravel, but stripped of any pretense of shopkeeper's politeness. "You asked to speak with us." She stood before the table, feeling like a supplicant before judges who had already decided her fate. Her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs, but she forced her voice to remain level, firm even as a cold fear seeped into her bones. "I did," she said, her gaze moving from one set of Moss Creek eyes to another. "I've learned a great deal since I returned. About my grandmother. About the family. About all the families." She took a shallow breath. "I'm not here to cause trouble. I just want to understand. I want transparency. The secrets. They're hurting people. They've always hurt people." The silence that followed was heavier than any she had yet experienced in this town. Eleanor Brewer's lips pressed into a thin, bloodless line. Samuel Sawyer's trembling hand stilled, as if he were consciously forcing it under control. Jeremiah leaned forward slightly, the wood groaning under his weight. "Some things are buried for a reason, girl. The past is a quiet place. It's best to let it lie." His tone was wrapped in a veneer of concern, a paternalistic warning that didn't quite mask the steel beneath. "Stirring up old history, it don't do no good. It only brings pain. For you, for everyone. For your safety, and for the peace of this town, you need to let this drop." "My safety." The words escaped before she could stop them, laced with a fear she couldn't conceal. "This is a close community," Eleanor Brewer said, her voice crisp and cold. "We look after our own. Outsiders. And those who think like outsiders, they often find it difficult. The past is our business. It's not for digging up and holding to the light." Alara's eyes flicked to Samuel's hand, the subtle, uncontrollable shake a living testament to the cost of that buried past. It underscored his next words, spoken with a weary finality. "Your grandmother understood. She accepted her duty. She kept her silence. She knew some truths are too heavy for the living to carry. Honor her memory. Leave it be." The hostility was not shouted. It was delivered in low, measured tones of warning and worn-out justification. They weren't monsters snarling from the dark. They were terrified guardians of a fragile, terrible peace, and her demand for transparency was a threat to the only world they knew how to maintain. Alara stood her ground, but the firmness she'd mustered was crumbling into a terrified understanding. They would not give her the truth. They would only give her a choice. Accept the silence, or become its enemy. The silence in the town hall was absolute, broken only by the faint, rhythmic tap of Samuel Sawyer's trembling finger against the oak table. The elders' faces were carved from the same weary, unyielding stone as the cave walls. Their refusal was a wall she could not scale, their concern a velvet glove over an iron fist. Alara's heart hammered, a trapped bird against her ribs. They spoke of her grandmother's duty, her silence. But Lillian had left a journal. She had left a key. That was not the act of a woman who wanted the past to stay buried forever. It was the act of a woman who wanted the truth to be found by the right person. "My grandmother left me her house," Alara said, her voice quieter now, but with a new, desperate firmness. "She left me everything. That includes her history. My history. I have a right to know who I am, who my parents were." The shift in the room was immediate and profound. The paternalistic concern evaporated, replaced by a cold, watchful stillness. Jeremiah Moss's eyes narrowed. Eleanor Brewer's hands, which had been folded neatly on the table, clenched into fists. "Your parents," Jeremiah said, the words slow and deliberate, "loved you. They wanted you to have a life away from here. That was their choice. Honoring that means letting them rest." "I'm not trying to dishonor them." The plea was torn from her. "I'm trying to understand them. The journal, the records. It's all there. Everything but them. Why is their story the one you want to hide the most?" It was Samuel who broke, his voice a thin, reedy thing filled with a pain that seemed to feed the tremor in his hand. "Because it's the most recent, girl. The closest to the surface. Digging there, it disturbs everything." He looked at his colleagues, a silent plea for support, then back at her, his expression one of profound exhaustion. They were good people. They did their duty. They married to keep a parcel of land from being split, to keep two strong lines together. It was a good match, a sensible match. The euphemisms were like a familiar, haunting melody. Asterisk duty. Strong lines. A sensible match star. What lines? Elara pressed, the dread a cold stone in her stomach. What were their names? Jeremiah Moss let out a long, slow breath, the sound of a man capitulating to the inevitable. He reached into a drawer of the table and withdrew a single, yellow document. He did not hand it to her, but laid it on the table, turning it to face her. It was a marriage certificate. This certifies the union of Robert James Moss and Anna Lee Moss. The same surname. Her blood went cold. She forced her eyes to the dates, to the parents' names listed below. Her father's father was Elias Moss. Her mother's mother was Lillian Moss Brewer. Her mind, now tragically adept at reading the town's terrible geometry, made the connection instantly. Elias and Lillian were siblings. Her parents were first cousins. The air left the room. The document on the table seemed to blur and swim. The elders' faces were masks of resigned inevitability. It was tradition, Eleanor said, her voice hollow. It was survival. The land, the name, it had to be kept together. They understood that. They accepted it. But Elara was no longer hearing their justifications. The betrayal was a physical blow, so complete and devastating it felt like the floor had fallen away beneath her. Every memory of her parents, their love, their laughter, their decision to send her away for a better life, was now cast in the stark, horrifying light of this truth. They hadn't just been products of this system. They had been its active, perpetuating agents. They had loved her, and they had sent her away to protect her from the very reality they had embodied. The grief that washed over her was not just for their loss, but for the beautiful, terrible lie of her entire existence. She was not just a product of Moss Creek. She was its most recent, most carefully hidden secret. The reckoning left Elara hollowed out, a vessel filled only with the cold, stark truth of her origins. The elders' justifications, asterisk tradition, survival asterisk, echoed in the silence of her grandmother's house, now feeling more like a mausoleum of secrets than a home. But the intellectual horror of her parents' union, the betrayal that had shaken her to her core, now demanded a colder, more clinical examination. The emotional storm had passed, leaving in its wake a grim, determined calm. She needed to understand the cost not as a story, but as a biological fact. Quietly, methodically, she began to research. She used the brittle, handwritten ledgers she had secretly borrowed from the cave. Not the carved stone, but the paper records stored in a rusted metal box deeper in the cavern, documenting births, deaths, and causes. She cross-referenced them with her grandmother's journal, with the family tree, building a database of misery in a modern notebook that felt alien amidst the oil lamps and parchment. The patterns that emerged were undeniable, a silent scream of data. The high rate of infant mortality was not scattered misfortune. It was a constant, grim baseline. Page after page of the ledgers, in faded, careful script, listed causes like childbed fever, failure to thrive, or simply God's will, but nestled among the euphemisms were more specific, telling entries. Seizures took several children in the 1920s. Blue spells and weak heart were common notations beside the names of infants who did not survive their first year. She found them, the conditions Martha had alluded to, the cost of the covenant. Recessive disorders, their likelihood multiplied exponentially by the tightly woven bloodlines. There were multiple mentions of fragile bones and unusual fractures in childhood, likely an osteogenesis imperfecta, carried silently through the generations. A branch of the family in the 1940s showed a cluster of children born with profound hearing loss, another classic hallmark of consanguinity. And then there were the hearts. So many notations of heart murmur, weak constitution, passed in his sleep, pointing toward a familial cardiomyopathy that had likely been the true culprit behind what was dismissed as bad luck or a fragile nature. She thought of Caleb's niece, of the tremor in Samuel Sawyer's hand. Likely an essential tremor, another common hereditary condition amplified by inbreeding. These weren't acts of God or the result of poor soil. They were the predictable, devastating result of a limited gene pool. A scientific reality the town had explained away for generations with folk wisdom and collective denial. The ledgers showed they had tracked the symptoms meticulously, even as they willfully ignored the cause. Alara's response was not anger or the desire to accuse. Sitting amidst the proof of centuries of silent suffering, her heart ached with a profound, empathetic sorrow. These were not monsters. They were her family. They were people who had loved their children, grieved their losses, and explained those losses away because the alternative, acknowledging that their very traditions were the source of the pain, was too terrible to bear. The genetic truth was not a weapon. It was a tragedy, written in the blood of every person in Moss Creek, including her own. Her horror was now tempered with a crushing weight of pity for the prison they had built not just of land and loyalty, but of their own bodies. The weight of the genetic truth settled over Alara not as a shock, but as a suffocating blanket of inevitability. She sat at her grandmother's kitchen table, the modern notebook of cold, hard data lying open beside the fragile, century-old ledgers from the cave. The numbers and patterns were indisputable. The suffering was quantifiable. Moss Creek was not just a social experiment. It was a genetic bottleneck, and the cost was etched in the tremors, the heart conditions, the tiny graves in the family plot. Her first primal instinct was flight. To pack her city-slick sedan with whatever would fit, to point it down the single thread of asphalt and never look back. To let the woods swallow the town and its terrible secrets again. She could return to a world of noise and anonymity, where faces were unique and history was a choice, not a birthright. The thought was a seductive whisper, a promise of peace. She stood, her chair scraping against the floorboards, and walked to the bedroom. She pulled her suitcase from the closet, the sound of the zipper loud and final in the silent house. She began to fold clothes, her movements sharp, automatic. Each sweater, each pair of pants, was a step away from the Moss Creek jaw, the wide-set eyes, the tangled web of blood that felt less like heritage and more like a congenital disease. But her hands stilled on a worn flannel shirt. She looked around the room, at the faint ghost of her grandmother's lavender scent still clinging to the air, at the photograph on the dresser of her parents. Their faces now understood in their heartbreaking context. They had sent her away to protect her from this, to give her a choice they never had. Leaving would be the ultimate betrayal of that sacrifice. It would be abandoning Caleb, who had trusted her with his own fears. It would be turning her back on Martha, whose weary confession had been a plea for understanding, not condemnation. It would be leaving an entire community to slowly wither under the weight of a truth they refused to name. She sank onto the edge of the bed, the half-packed suitcase gaping open like a mouth. The choice was not between truth and lies. It was between condemnation and compassion, between being an outsider who exposed their shame or a member of the family who tried to alleviate their pain. Outside, a slow, dreary rain began to fall, pattering against the window pane and casting the world in a blur of gray and green. The fog, a constant companion in the hollows, crept down from the wooded hills, obscuring the path out, mirroring the murky uncertainty clouding her mind. To leave was to save herself. To stay was to try and save them all from the very traditions they clung to for survival. She looked at her reflection in the rain-streaked window, a face that was a map of Moss Creek, product of its choices. She could be just a product or she could be something else. The zipper on the suitcase remained open, the journey away suspended in the tense, foggy stillness of her indecision. The rain fell in a soft, persistent drizzle, blurring the line between the woods and the sky, sealing the hollow in a cocoon of gray. The suitcase remained on the bed, its contents half-folded, the zipper a stark, unfinished line. Alara stood at the window, watching the water trace paths down the glass, each droplet a mirror of the conflicting currents within her. To leave was to preserve a version of herself untouched by the creek's grim reality. To stay was to accept that she was irrevocably part of it, her own blood a testament to its history and its cost. The choice was not between right and wrong, but between two different kinds of truth. One was a clean, solitary truth of escape. The other was a messy, entangled truth of belonging. She thought of Caleb's conflicted eyes, of Martha's weary confession, of the children in the ledgers whose lives were abbreviated by fragile constitutions. They weren't abstractions. They were her people, her family, Condemning them from afar would be easy, but it would change nothing. It would only add another layer of pain to their isolation. Her decision did not arrive as a thunderclap, but as a quiet, solid certainty that settled in the space the fear had occupied. She would not leave, but she would not simply accept. She would not mount a grand, confrontational crusade. The town's walls were too thick for that. Instead, she would plant seeds. Small, quiet acts of change that acknowledged the past without being enslaved by it. Her first act was to walk through the rain to the general store. The bell chimed its familiar, tinny note. Jeremiah Moss looked up from his ledger, his expression guarded, expecting another confrontation. "I'd like to place an order," Alara said, her voice calm, firm. She slid a piece of paper across the counter. It was not a list of supplies. It was the name and address of a genetic counseling service based in Lexington, and a request for informational pamphlets on hereditary health conditions to be mailed to a post office box she'd rented in the next town over. Jeremiah's eyes scanned the paper, his face unreadable. He didn't refuse. He didn't agree. He simply gave a slow, non-committal nod and tucked the paper under the ledge of the counter, a silent, tentative acceptance of a crack in the dam. Her next stop was Caleb's farm. She found him mending a fence in the misting rain, his shoulders tense. He watched her approach, his hazel eyes wary. "I'm not leaving," she said without preamble. The relief that washed over his face was palpable, followed quickly by a flicker of anxiety. "What does that mean?" "It means I'm going to try to help," she said. Quietly, "I've asked for information. About the things that run in families. For anyone who wants to see it." His support was hesitant, a fragile thing. He looked down at the post-hole digger in his hands, then back at her. "It won't be welcome. Most folks, they'd rather not know." "I know," she said, "but the option should be there. For your niece. For the future." He was silent for a long moment, the rain dripping from the brim of his hat. Finally, he gave a single, slow nod. It wasn't enthusiastic endorsement. It was a weary, hopeful capitulation to the possibility of a different way. "All right," he murmured. "All right." As she walked back to the house, she felt the weight of eyes upon her. From behind a rain-streaked window, from the shelter of a barn door, the townsfolk watched. They did not wave. They did not smile in welcome. Their gazes were cautious, suspicious, a community holding its breath, waiting to see if this new branch, this product of their blood who had tasted the outside world, would take root or be rejected. The legacy of Moss Creek continued, but for the first time in 2 centuries, its path was no longer certain. The rain ceased by evening, leaving the world washed clean and dripping, the air sharp with the scent of wet earth and decay. Alara stood on the porch, the weathered board still dark with moisture, and watched the mist rise from the creek like ghosts of the past finally exhaling. The decision was made. The suitcase was unpacked, its contents returned to drawers that now felt less like a temporary repository and more like a claim staked. She was not an outsider anymore, nor was she simply a product of this place. She was both, and she was something new. "I am both product and reformer," she thought, the words solid in her mind. The horror was not gone, but it had been joined by a grim sense of purpose. She would honor her grandmother's memory not by perpetuating her silent resignation, but by challenging the very foundations of it, gently, patiently, from within. She turned and went back inside, the house groaning softly around her as it settled into the damp night. She walked to the parlor, to the wall where the oldest portrait hung. A severe-looking woman from the 1880s, her Moss Creek jaw set in a line of iron determination, her pale eyes seeming to follow you around the room. Alara lit the oil lamp on the table beneath it, the flame casting a warm, wavering glow. She stood before the portrait, studying the face that was so clearly a blueprint for her own. The same stubborn line of the jaw, the same wide-set eyes, the same faint, asymmetrical arch to the brow. The features were identical, separated by over a century, bound by blood. Slowly, she moved to stand beside the heavy, tarnished frame, aligning her face with the painted one in the dim light. She looked at their reflections in the glass, her living face beside the preserved one. The resemblance was uncanny, a chilling echo across time. The same blood, the same history, the same potential for both strength and fragility ran through them both. But then she looked closer at the eyes. The woman in the portrait's eyes held a hard, accepted certainty, a gaze that had never known another possibility. Alara's own eyes, reflected in the glass, held that same inherited weight, but now also a flicker of something else. A resolve, a determination to forge a different path from the same tangled roots. They were similar, but they were not the same. From the window, she could see a light burning in a farmhouse up the hill, Caleb's house, and further down the creek, the soft glow from the general store. They were watching, she knew. The town was always watching, a single, cautious organism assessing the new element in its midst. There would be no welcoming party, no sudden embrace. Change here would be measured in generations, not days. It would be resisted, questioned, met with silence and suspicion. Alara did not look away from the watching dark. She accepted her place in the web, the weight of her legacy, and the long, slow work that lay ahead. She would honor the past by refusing to repeat its mistakes, and the town would watch cautiously, waiting to see if the echo in the blood would finally learn to sing a new song.